I think the purpose of this NATO summit from the European standpoint is to somehow or another find ways to drag the United States back into Europe and harness whatever American military power is available in all its forms, supplies and otherwise, to this failed war in Ukraine. I mean, that's it. That's the number one point on the agenda. If you listen to this Mark Rutte, the Dutchman, I mean, he's pathetic. Oh, we love America. We're all loyal to America. Blah, blah, blah. Please come and do this. I don't see much coming out of it, frankly, but you never know. I mean, President Trump hasn't been very decisive with regard to disengaging, as all of us had hoped that voted for him. So I don't know what he'll do. Now, on the other hand, there's another part of the NATO summit that isn't getting much attention, but is very, very important behind the scenes. And that is what are the relations with the Turks. And Mr. Erdogan, has always been very good at straddling the fence, taking advantage of whatever benefits there are to doing so. And I imagine President Trump is anxious to cultivate him and find new ways to bribe him into doing nothing against the Israelis. So I think that'll be a top priority. I imagine it has something to do with the F-35 and other goodies that may be available to him if he tolerates Israeli or Jewish hegemony over the region. Well, I think the Europeans know that in the absence of American Israeli influence and power in the region, there are two states which are going to emerge as the dominant powers in the Middle East. One is Turkey or Turkey, and the other is, of course, Iran or Persia. I think that's inevitable. And this is why I think we're we're playing a losing hand because we can't stop that. Those things are irreversible. Both of those states are historic powers, both civilizational states in their own right. The Ottoman Turks were the center of the Islamic world as far as the Sunnis were concerned, and represented that particular branch of humanity. Then, on the other hand, you have Persia, which, for all sorts of reasons, is also a civilizational state. So those two things are unchanging, unless, of course, President Trump succeeds in causing the disintegration of Iran and its total obliteration at some point. I don't think that's going to happen, but there are still lots of people talking about that in Washington. I think the Iranians are aware of it. So, as far as NATO is concerned, the Europeans are simply worried about these Turks. The Turks have threatened Europe for centuries. The Turks are back, and they're wondering what they're going to do about it because their historic ally against the Turks, of course, is Russia. But we've gone out of our way to make the Russians miserable and hate us. So, where do the Europeans turn now? They don't really want enemies in Turkey, but they can't exactly be friends because they've got too many Turks in Europe they'd like to get rid of. Let's be frank, that's what they would like to do. So this is a real mess. And into this steps Donald Trump, whose vision is about, I guess, 16 inches in front of his nose, if that. And his background in all of this, non-existent, who is surrounded by Zionists and people who are interested in what is on the Jewish agenda. So that's a pretty bad position for him to be in. It's a losing proposition, in my judgment. And I don't think it's an accident that Erdogan talks about eventually Turkish forces liberating Jerusalem. And in contrast to the people in the United States and many in Western Europe who are paying no attention to the tragedy in Gaza or anywhere else, everybody else is watching. And Gaza has not escaped attention in Istanbul. If you go to Istanbul, you find museum-like documentary, what's the right word, displays in what were formerly stores and malls and so forth, where you see the entire story of Gaza told in very frightening and terrible terms. And Hamas is depicted as standing tall and straight, despite the fact that they continue to take losses. They're there. And that makes them heroic defenders of Islam. So I think those are the two big things. One is what do we do about the war in Ukraine against Russia? How do we keep the Americans in it? How can we be part of it? I think it's the question that Trump wants to answer because he only has so much equipment, so many missiles, so much money that he can squander on either of these. And we haven't even talked about Venezuela, Cuba, or Mexico, all three of which are very friendly to Russia and essentially anti-American. Well, obviously, the failure or fall of the fortress cities in the center is a strategic inflection point. That makes it very hard for the Ukrainians to maintain any sort of effective defense in eastern Ukraine. The Russians are moving ever closer to Zaporizhia and realizing their goal of reconquering, consolidating, and holding Novorossiya. No question about it. Remember that from the very beginning, many have said Kharkov and Odessa are historically Russian cities and they will be Russian again. So I think we have to keep that in mind. But President Putin has been preeminently concerned with avoiding a war against NATO. That's his nightmare, not because he thinks he can't win it. He doesn't want to be bothered with it. Why would you want to do that? And ultimately, contrary to what everybody in Europe says, the globalists ruling the European continent, he wants to do business with the West. He doesn't want to destroy it. Now, there have been some interesting developments. Recently, the Polish government asked to have returned to it the White Eagle order that had been given to Zelensky. I guess the Poles have now figured out what they're dealing with in Kiev and discovered, no, we don't necessarily like Zelensky or his regime. They've also decided to unclassify or declassify all the information surrounding the shipment of arms and equipment and support into Ukraine. They haven't mentioned the roughly 10,000 plus Polish soldiers who died over there trying to help the Ukrainians, but I don't expect that to come up for public discussion right now. But having said all of that, I think this is very important. Poland is the frontline state. Poland is supposed to be the place where we make war on Russia via Ukraine. Poland has had enough of that. They're trying to dispose of their Ukrainians. They've got too many in the country. They don't want them there. They're a problem. So, how does Europe square that with all the anti-Russian nonsense? I think over time it's going to be harder to do that. On the other hand, you have bad news up in Scandinavia. You have this very foolish Finnish president who now is boasting about welcoming U.S. forces into Finland along with U.S. nuclear weapons. The only conclusion I can reach is the man is utterly stupid or has a death wish. And I've said the same thing to people in Sweden. I know the populations in Finland and Sweden were never asked about any of this. If you had a referendum in either of those countries, I don't think they would today be inside NATO. But they're there. And these kinds of foolish statements are outrageous. And we've had something released in the press recently. I'm sure you've seen it. The two Russian pranksters had called what is it, the president of Estonia? Was that who it was? I think it was. And this man said, "Oh yes, we're delighted to assist and support the Ukrainians in attacking St. Petersburg, and they can use our airspace, launch from here, and so forth." Of course, now the Russians are not surprised. I mean, the Russians know this is going on, but we and our friends in Western Europe have pretended this is not the case. So we're back to another problem, and that is that small nations in the Baltic littoral, once again, could be a very dangerous opportunity for us. I sometimes go back and I try to remind people that in 1879 or 1878, in that time frame, just before the Congress of Berlin, the German newspapers were filled with all this anti-Russian propaganda. And Bismarck was horrified because they had effectively an alliance with the Tsar. He went to the King of Prussia, who was then the Emperor of Germany, and eventually the King of Prussia went to the border with Russia, and he and Alexander III met and embraced and said, "Well, we don't want a war. We're not going to allow this to happen." But Bismarck had to go to the parliament, and he told the Reichstag, "Look, this is crazy. We don't want a war with the Russians." And they didn't listen to him. So he brought in von Moltke, the great chief of the German general staff, the hero of the wars of unification. And he stood up there and he said, "We have no need of land." Think about that, because, just what is it, less than 100 years later, Hitler's running around about Lebensraum, but he says, "We have no need of land, and we don't need, they have no gold. In other words, what are we going to get for our trouble? They don't have it. You know, ultimately, Bismarck and Moltke and the king won, and there was no war with Russia, at least not until 1914. And then it wasn't necessary either, but the Tsar foolishly embarked on that at the time. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that here we are, what, 7,000 miles away. We're the so-called superpower, although I prefer to say we may be the greatest of the great powers, but that's all we are, a great power. But nevertheless, we're in a state where we could be dragged involuntarily into a confrontation with Russia on Russia's doorstep. What is the lesson of the last several years? Don't fight your opponent on his doorstep. I mean, that's like, well, let's have the Russian army come to Mexico or the Chinese army come to Mexico. That's a war we can win, you know? How stupid can you be? Exceptionally stupid. So I would hope that someone is talking in those terms to Donald Trump, but I have no way of knowing. And I continue to be depressed, disappointed by the people that surround him that I don't think have any depth at all. The conditions in Iran and Ukraine are a little similar insofar as in both cases we are involved in a war to the last missile. I mean, we were saying we're going to fight this war until the last Ukrainian. Well, we've seen at least 1.4, 1.5 million killed, another million plus wounded. The state is in ruins. Millions have left the country. Millions more would leave if they could. Uh, the Ukrainian nation is on life support, all right? That doesn't seem to make any difference as long as you have missiles. And I think we're in the same position down in the Middle East. How many missiles have we got on hand? Now, recently, I discovered that the United States Navy currently has more launchers, more launch tubes than missiles. They can't fill all of the launch tubes and weapon systems that they have. Now, what that may mean inside the Navy is, well, don't worry about that. We'll just fill up the ones in the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, and then the rest will catch up later. But we haven't seen much success on Trump's part in terms of mobilizing the scientific industrial base to produce weapons and weapon systems and so forth for us, let alone shipment overseas. That's why your friend Zelensky, or our friend Zelensky, was saying, I need everything now. Forget these contracts for 2027. Well, he's on his last legs. He's losing badly. With a little help, he'll be gone. But does Trump understand that? Does he understand that? Is he capable of making a choice? I haven't seen any decisiveness from him. Any great leader of a great power would say, well, wait a minute. First thing we have to do is get rid of this two-front war. You know, so take your pick. What's most important to you? Well, I would argue right away, we would like good relations with Russia. So let's get rid of this Ukrainian mess right away, as quickly as possible. Cut them off. All right. That's number one. Number two, if we cut them off, perhaps the Russians will be helpful to us in the Middle East so that we can put an end to that nonsense. I think that's unlikely now, but it was always a possibility for quite a while that we could have had some help and assistance from them. So that leaves you in the Middle East, and you have the Israelis who are in the war to the last missile, and they're prepared to go down fighting, which they, I think, increasingly expect to do. That's why you're seeing the mass murder expulsion campaigns with this man Gavir on the West Bank destroying homes, driving out uh, Palestinian Arabs who are Christians and Muslims, and a resumption of killing, not on the scale as before, but periodic killing in Gaza. And Lebanon, of course, is in ruins with God knows how many people killed or murdered there. They are going to do it and do it and do it as long as they can. And we are going to be squeezed hard to support it. I think, isn't or Prime Minister Netanyahu planning a visit here soon? And I think he's in a countdown. He knows how long can we afford to wait? Because while we're trying to build up our arsenal on which the Israelis are also dependent, Iran's position grows stronger, not weaker. All you have to do to see evidence for that is see the funeral. And people are looking at the funeral and say, well, these people are all religious fanatics. No, 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 that's not it at all. This is a catharsis. This murdered leader is a metaphor for what's happened to the entire Persian nation. People, 12 million of them, are there to mourn what's being done to their country. You've seen this in Russia. All you have to do is go to Stalingrad. It's now Volgograd. Visit the memorial there. The visit there is a catharsis because of how horrific that war was. These things happen. So we've strengthened Iran, and you've got a man who is by nature in Donald Trump the microwave thinker. Open it up. I got what I want. We're going to win. We're going to get what we want. Okay, good luck. No sense of maybe now's a bad time. Maybe this is the wrong fight to fight. No, no sense of that at all. No sense of limitations on resources and no sense of limitations on interests because the Americans have no interest, quite frankly, in what we're doing at all today in the Middle East. None. On the other hand, if you look at Venezuela, you look at Cuba, you look at Mexico, these three countries have always been very friendly, if not outright allies, against us. They were pro-communist when Franco was fighting to save Spain from communism. Franco is now vilified as evil fascist, but people forget that the alternative at the time was not very attractive. It was Soviet. So I don't know what you do. We have nobody with any real brains, breadth, or experience at the helm, I think. That's the point. Brains, breadth, and experience. Not saying they're stupid, but the ability to think clearly is a huge problem.